We'll try it. Раз. Дорогі гості, масковані і не масковані, вітаємо вас всіх. І ми вас вітаємо, але нас всіх вітає чудове сонечко, яке не хоче нас сьогодні зрадити. Це наш перший раз, що ми пробуємо так званий Outdoor Garden Party. І ми дуже раді, що ви всі так гарно виглядаєте. І що ви всі так гарно не тільки виглядаєте, але що ви тут гарно виглядаєте. Це наша перша спроба на відкриття сезону на дворі. І ми дуже вдячні, що маємо надзвичайно гарну виставку, яку для нас тут кураторував, чи пильнував, чи опікувався, то наш пан Олег Лисюк, який із його комітетом, який це все для нас підготовили, і який пізніше поясниться мистецький аспект Керри Парнell, художниці, яке це все підготовила. А тепер ще більшу честь маємо, тому що це справа інтернування українців і інших канадців тут в Канаді. Є такий endowment фонд, який пильнує такі речі і розповсюдження інформації про справи, які зв'язані з endowment і з internment. То тепер попрошу тимчасового голову цієї фундації, пана Бориса Балана, який just happens to be here today. Дуже вітаємо.
Дякую, Юрій. Привіт і добрий день всім тут. Я хочу вперше від імені нашої Endowment Council, the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund, подякувати і признати труд, який художник Керри Парнell робили в підготовці цієї виставки. Я думаю, що як ви ще не побачили, ви ще побачите, яка це цікава виставка. І там дуже багато і до роздуму про ту інтермент, що відбувся, і з художнього, і з історичного боку. Теж хочу подякувати дирекції і адміністрації Канадсько-Української мистецької фундації за цю виставку, що вони це робили, щоб представити ці твори, і ця ідея всім тут присутнім. The Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund is a $10 million endowment established by the federal government to support projects that commemorate and recognize the experience of all ethnocultural communities affected by Canada's national internment operation of 1914 to 1920. Since the inception of the fund, the Endowment Council, which is the body that oversees and manages the granting of funds, has awarded over $4 million in grants to projects and initiatives which are intended to popularize and get the whole idea of the internment fund, the internment experience, known by the Canadian society at large. The grants that the Endowment Council has funded include things like historical exhibits, commemorative plaques and statues, the restoration of internee cemeteries, which we think is a very important element of their work to commemorate the losses that occurred during that very terrible time. Films, research, artistic endeavors like what you're going to see today, symposia, and various educational resources, among other things. So it's a very wide range of activities, and as I said, over $4 million has been provided to fund these works. Internment impacted over 8,500 people of a variety of backgrounds. Ukrainians, Kurds, Armenians, Bulgarians, Croats, Czechs, all sorts of people, many people. Although without doubt the largest single group was the Ukrainian component, because it was the largest Ukrainian community in Canada of these ethnocultural groups that came from the part of the world that at that time was under the occupation or under the rule of the Central Powers, which we were at war with as Canadians. These men and women, 8,500 people, were interned in over 24 internment camps, including one briefly here in Toronto at Stanley Barracks downtown. This internment operation, which was initiated over 100 years, had a very devastating effect on community development, and our community, the Ukrainian community, and other ethnocultural groups are affected, obviously. That we had the burden of that for many years to come out of it, and to recover from that, from the stigma of being interned as enemy aliens in a country that you've come to emigrate to, that you wanted to make your future and that you wanted to contribute to. You know, but it didn't work out that way for so many people, including over 100 people who died in these internment camps from influenza or TB, and some were even shot trying to escape. It was a very great personal tragedy for them and a community tragedy for so many others. While they're not here to tell that story, the work that you're going to see today helps you to see that story in a different light through the artistic impressions of Kerri Parnell, and I encourage you all to look at it, to enjoy it, and to take advantage of the other books that are for sale in there, to learn more about it, and more importantly, to listen to my friend and colleague, Dr. Bumilichuk, who's going to say something more substantial about the internment operation.
Пане Борис, дуже дякую. Ми тут так звано, ми маємо програму, але вона є така трохи fluid, бо ми це перший раз робимо. Але я щойно тут через маску побачив пана Райан Бойко, який режисер фільмовий, який дуже багато праці вклав власне на тему розповсюдження справи internment тут в Канаді. So Ryan, welcome. And we're also, I don't know how we managed to do this, but we identified the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, who happens to be sitting here. And we're not going to let her get away without saying a little bit of a word of greeting to us. To Pani Lesiu, proszę.
Дякую, Юрку. Вітаю нашу цілу громаду. Я думаю, що це, перше все подякувати хочу організаторам сьогоднішнього відкриття в таких складних умовах. I think it's a sign of the resilience of our community that we continue to soldier on. We are not going to be defeated. We are continuing to gather in safe ways and to promote our cultural and heritage institutions. So thank you to the organizers of today's event. I will not belabor the point. I will not speak long because this is the first time in over 6 months that I'm wearing pantyhose and shoes, and I'm in some degree of discomfort, and I would love to sit down. So I will turn the microphone over to Yurko again.
Nothing like getting personal at public events. But we welcome you. So, дуже дякую. Now we're going into the more, not necessarily formal, but indeed an insight into why we are doing this. We have a vice president and a member of the board of directors. And as I mentioned, board of directors, I'm very grateful that quite a lot of you are out there in the audience. And if you would like to talk with them later about some of our programs, we'd appreciate that very much. We have a little bit of a surprise to announce here to you that relates to a forward way of looking at art, a possible opportunity to view the Van Gogh exhibit that's in Toronto that will be available to all of our members. But in the meantime, let's talk about our exhibit today. And to explain the artist, the thinking of the artist, Ms. Parnell, who I think is from Winnipeg, was supposed to join us and did not because of, I guess, obvious circumstances. But we have here Dr. Oleg Lusuk to explain in detail the artistic merits of what we are here to see today. Panie Oleg, proszę.
Дякую, пане Юрій. Я ще не доктор, я ще тільки вчуся. Шановні члени, дорогі члени КУМФ, дорогі наші гості, українська громада. Дякуємо, що ви так сьогодні представницько досить прийшли. Бо дійсно, як згадував пан Юрій Клюфас, ми, будучи по півроку, як і більшість організацій зачинені, ми переживали, як ми зможемо відчинитися для людей знову. І чи люди до нас повернуться, чи пам'ятають, чи люблять. І для нас це дійсно такий хвилюючий момент. Отже, ми сильно готувалися, думали, щоб то все гарно відбулося. І дякувати Богу, що дійсно нам і погода якось сприяє, бо такий сьогодні був багатообіцяючий ранок, що не знали, як то відбудеться. І отже, думаючи над тим, як ми відкриємо наш сезон осінній, а це переважно ми відчиняємося після перерви такої літньої, а це вже як півроку, ми думаємо над тим, як зробити більш таки вражаючий і цікавіше, щоб запам'яталося цей сезон, початок відкриття сезону. І, власне, ця виставка Pause in Plight, перервана обіцянка, яка приїхала до нас з Вінніпегу, авторства Керрі Парнел, вона є, на нашу думку, якраз тим сильним таким поштовхом, не тільки мистецьким, а також і політичним, і освітянським, бо ця виставка, якщо згадувалося, вона присвячена інтернованим українцям і неукраїнцям в Канаді, які проживали 1914-1920 роки. Ця трагічна сторінка історії Канади, яка довший час не визнавалася, не було просто поширена про це інформація, є досить мало знаною ще серед загального кількості людей і особливо молодого покоління учнів. І тому ми, як лідери, в даному випадку це є прем'єра, ця виставка, і це є прем'єра всеканадського туру, який буде відбуватися на протязі 5 років. Від цього року до 2025 року ця виставка має подорожувати по Канаді. От сьогодні ви маєте змогу перше побачити її в такому вигляді, як вона задумала Керрі Парнел. Кілька слів скажу про мисткиню. Hi Kerri, you're probably watching this on the live stream. About Kerri Parnell. Kerri Parnell creates art that inspires community connections. Born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Kerri attended the University of Manitoba School of Fine Arts and the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her passion is to collaborate with others on projects that promote social awareness and change. Her results in both thought-provoking and aesthetically beautiful. Nowhere is this more evident than Pause in Plight. І кілька слів про цю виставку, яка сьогодні експонується. The 17-piece art exhibit, created in support from the Endowment Council of the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund, aims to inform the masses of the World War I national security fears and wartime prejudice, which led to the internment of 8,579 men, among them women and children, identified as enemy allies. Pause in Plight will tour across Canada between 2020 and 2025 to help bring awareness to this historical injustice. The Internment Art Exhibit is laid out in 5 different sections: war posters, light installation, emotional interpretation series, old eye series, and to help with the enemy, line enemy. І на закінчення, завершення хотів сказати, що в нас на продаж є каталог, виданий спеціально до тої виставки. Ви можете його придбати тут, при дверях чи на виставці. Прошу, подивіться, дуже гарна якість видання, надзвичайно гарні видані ілюстрації. Сама виставка дуже вражаюча. Ви, напевно, будете дуже емоційно якось зачеплені, тому що вона не просто є мистецька виставка, як твір мистецтва, це така емоційна виставка, яка зачеплює якісь тонкі нотки душі. Також ми маємо на продаж і постерс, і принтс, так що ви можете подивитися ті принts, дуже гарні принts, і придбати їх також собі, якщо вам сподобається якась тема. Наразі дякую і прошу.
Пане Олег, sorry about the doctor, but, дуже приємно було слухати вас. І ми тепер підходимо до моменту pièce de résistance. Тут згадував пан Олег, що це все є дуже емоційна виставка, яка витворює ті почуття, які, можливо, інтерновані люди відчували в той час, як їх арештовано, і як вони сиділи незрозуміло в тих тюрмах всі ті роки. І тепер правдивий доктор Любомир Луцюк нам пояснить, що дійсно і як дійсно воно там все відбувалося, щоб ми розуміли краще і глибоко, що дійсно пережили ті люди тоді, які разом, може не в такий, може в ще й сильніший спосіб, як наші батьки, які приїхали пізніше, але люди, які простелили нам сьогодні тут дорогу, на якій ми собі відносно легко живемо і користуємося з тої праці, з тих почуттів, з тої роботи, які виконували наші предки в різних частинах Канади. So we thank you very much for looking very fresh after your long drive from Kingston, and welcome you to the podium. Dr. Любомир Луцюк. Вітаємо.
Good afternoon. Before I begin speaking to the themes that I have been asked to address, I'd like to thank the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund for making it possible for me to be here, and to KUMF for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. I recognize present amongst us the current chairman of the Endowment Council, Boris Blon, who you heard from, and several former members, including Lashka Kachi, who was representing the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and is now the president of the Congress, Dan Dragasevich, who was there for the Serbian Canadian community and served very, very well, and also some beneficiaries of the kinds of grants that we have given out over the years to commemorate and educate our fellow Canadians about the internment operations, including Ryan Boyko, the filmmaker who has created some very powerful film images about the internment operations, both the series called The Camps and That Never Happened, and I'll refer to actually that a little bit later. Now, this is for me also a rather unusual circumstance. I usually don't give sermons on the Mount, and this is certainly my first COVID lecture. It made me think about it yesterday when I was just by chance bumped into a woman who is living in Kingston of Ukrainian heritage, who was one of the interwar immigrant children. And we were talking about how life was going, and she said, "Do you remember when we were young?" And I said, "Yes, a long time ago." She said, "What swear word did you get taught by your parents?" And I said, "Well, my parents actually only ever taught me one Ukrainian swear word, cholera, or cholera yasna. So I suppose we should be now saying COVID yasna, as we live through these weird times." Anyway, what I want to talk about is less the actual historical details about what happened during Canada's first national internment operations. There's a very good little booklet that we put out some years ago through the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association. It's now been reprinted by the Endowment Council. You can pick up a copy for free inside. It has all the basic details, so I won't go through those, and I think a lot of them, you know them anyway. What I want to do is talk about this particular exhibit and what it made me think about, and why I think it lays the foundations for a fairly profound change in our community that's just around the corner. And you're the first people I've actually shared these thoughts with, so, you know, they're still a little raw, but I hope you will find them interesting. First of all, let's think about the title of this exhibit, Pause in Plight. Pause in Plight. When I first heard it, and I was a member of the council at that time when Ms. Parnell applied for a grant, I said to myself, I hate that. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. I did not understand the concept behind her art, and I admit it. So I've been thinking a lot in recent days about pause in plight, and I tried to break the phrase down so I could better comprehend it. And the first word I focused on was plight. What is the meaning of plight? Well, when you think about it, it's a predicament. It's a mess. It's a condition or a situation of difficulty. It is, in effect, an affliction. An affliction. And when I thought about that word, an affliction, and how something is in a predicament that is troubling, that is difficult, that is messy, I thought that's a perfect description, a perfect adjective for the Ukrainian Canadian community today, for the organized Ukrainian Canadian community. Now, I'm not talking about the 1.3, 1.4 Canadians of Ukrainian origin that we always hear about, that we always talk about. I'm talking about the people like you who are in the organized Ukrainian community, who belong to the churches, the organizations, who support the foundations, who are actually engaged in community life. And I thought to myself, why are we as a Hromada today the way we are today? And in my view, it's because of the crippling legacy of Canada's first national internment operations. Think back to when you were a teenager or in your early 20s. If the government had arrested you because of who you were, where you came from, because of your name, because you were the other, because you were one day defined as an enemy alien, whereas the day before you were being brought to Canada as an immigrant for your labor, overnight you become the enemy, you become the other. And I think that that impact, that trauma that occurred between 1914 and 1920 had a lasting consequence on our organizational structures. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. Now, most of us probably don't recognize that we are in plight. You might say to me, and my friend Yuri Klufwitz mentioned this, we're living a good life. We have, ministers of the crown, we have lawyers, we've had Supreme Court judges, we've had all sorts of people in high positions. And yet, have we had our fair share? I think all of you would agree we haven't. There's not a single Ukrainian Canadian senator right now. There are no Supreme Court judges of Ukrainian heritage. Nobody is talking about promoting Ukrainians into positions on the basis of any kind of quota. And yet we as a community, and other Europeans as well, the Serbians, the Croatians, etc., suffered the indignity, the humiliation of being rounded up as enemy aliens and placed in 24 Canadian concentration camps from coast to coast, where our labor was exploited, our wealth was confiscated, and we were faced with the prospect of deportation or worse. Over 8,500 interned, over 80,000 people registered as enemy aliens. Now think about it. There were about 170,000 Ukrainians who came to Canada, lured here with promises of freedom and free land between 1891 and 1914. 80,000, about half, were registered as enemy aliens and forced to report regularly to the authorities. This was a trauma. Now, many of us, don't know much about this. Why? Because of the history of Ukrainian immigration to Canada. You've all heard the story about how there were waves of immigration. The first wave, 1891 to the outbreak of World War I, 170,000 people. The second interwar wave, somewhere around 70,000 between the two world wars. And then the third wave, many of us are the children or the grandchildren of that third DP wave, those who came here after the Second World War, somewhere between 35 and 40,000. And now a fourth wave. Each one of those waves has come with a different cause, a different sense of itself, a different worldview. The first wave, the largest, came as immigrants seeking freedom and free land. The people in the interwar period came, some of them seeking economic opportunity, others who were refugees, exiles from the failed attempts to secure Ukraine's independence. The third DP wave, if you want to call them that, came largely because they had fought for Ukraine's independence against both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And finally, the fourth wave, again, coming for economic opportunity. None of these things is wrong. They all came for different reasons, but they were spread out socially, geographically across the country. They did not interact as much as perhaps they might otherwise have. And so they did not learn the history collectively of our community. They knew their history. My parents could tell you all you needed to know about the Holodomor, all you needed to know about Nazi Germany and tyranny in Ukraine, all about the Soviets, all these kinds of things. But they knew not a word about Canada's first national internment operations, even though I am born and raised in Kingston and literally played in the shadow of Canada's first national camp at Fort Henry. Why? We didn't know our own history, so we are partially to blame. We haven't studied our own story. There's also the other side of this, them. So there's us, and there's them. The government instilled fear in our community during the First World War period. It is simply a fact. You can look at the words of Hugh MacDonald. Who was Hugh MacDonald? He was the son of Sir John A. Macdonald. Everybody's talking about taking down statues of Sir John A. now. You can think what you want about that. Nobody's talking about taking down the statue of Hugh MacDonald, a police magistrate who said that fear, that was a word he used, should be used against these Ukrainians, and sooner than later they will be as easily controlled as a lot of sheep. I quote him. So that's the kind of prejudice and xenophobia that informed decision-making in that period of time. Now, in this context, in this conflict between them and us, we were the weaker party. And so many people did the normal thing. And that's why they're not part of the organized community today. They changed their names. They stopped going to the churches, the Ukrainian Pravoslavna or Catholic Church. Our community was fragmented. Some resisted on the left, unfortunately taking a pro-Soviet point of view. Some resisted on the right, joining the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League, or UNO, the Ukrainian National Federation, but hiding their nationalism because they were afraid that if it showed, they might be interned again. Some acculturated, assimilated, integrated, intermarried, whatever term you want to use, they just disappeared. And we all know them. You've all met people who say, oh yeah, my grandfather was Ukrainian, but my name is Wilson or Smith or Brown or Pierre, whatever it may be. These are people that we shouldn't shun. They simply did what most did, which was escape to some kind of safety. So a minority resisted, but the majority disappeared, or certainly went to ground. Our community was fragmented. But this did not mean that Ottawa's surveillance of our community ceased. Quite to the contrary. We have irrefutable evidence that the government of Canada continued to monitor internal Ukrainian Canadian community activity well into the Cold War. We know for a fact that there were agents within the Ukrainian Canadian community who regularly reported to Ottawa on the doings, comings, and goings of Ukrainian leaders and other individuals. So, we were still under surveillance when the Second World War broke out in September of 1939. And in fact, we have documentary evidence which shows that government agents knew that the leaders of our community at the time, the people that created the Ukrainian National Federation, for example, were still, quote, in fear of the barbed wire fence. That's a pretty unambiguous statement. Our community's leaders were still in fear of the barbed wire fence in 1940. So what did the government do? What the government did in November of 1940 was it said, there's fragmentation in the Ukrainian community, there are differences of opinion, there's a struggle between the left and the right, we're going to get rid of the left, and so they interned them or took away their halls. And as for the center and the right, what are we going to do with them? We're going to force unity upon them. So in November of 1940, the government of Canada in Winnipeg, where Ms. Parnell comes from, created the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, KUK, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. There's no doubt about this. Now, That was a pretty heavy-handed intervention into our internal affairs. The president of KUMF is sitting here today. She knows this story. We should learn this story because there's a renaissance coming, and it's coming soon, and I'll explain why in a moment. When the war broke out, of course, there was a whole generation of born in Canada Ukrainian Canadians. People like Bogdan Panchuk, Stanley Frolik, Tony Yadamovich, Anne Hrapleva, Helen Kozicki, Bill Kiriluk. Some of you knew these people. These were the sons and daughters of the internees. These were the sons and daughters of the enemy aliens. And they said to themselves, there's a war. What happened the last time there was a war? They interned us. Why did they intern us? Because they thought we were enemy aliens. Why were we enemy aliens? Not because of anything we'd done wrong, but only because of who we are, where we came from. Because we have names like Bogdan Panchuk or Lyubomir Luchuk or Boris Balan or what have you. And so those young men and women did the right thing. They said, we will prove our loyalty in a way that no one can deny us by volunteering to join in the ranks of the Canadian Army, Navy, Air Force, and Merchant Marine. And in their thousands, Canadians of Ukrainian origin, Canadian-born, young men and women born in Canada, the sons and daughters of the internees and the enemy aliens, went to fight for the country that had interned their parents or grandparents and prove their loyalty. And they created in England an organization known as the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen's Association, UKSA, and it was under government surveillance all the time, trust me. And they bonded together. They had their own London club at 218 Sussex Gardens where they would meet and they would have get-togethers and they would celebrate Ukrainian Rіздво and Velykdень. They came together and they stayed together and they served and they sacrificed and they proved who they were. And Canada at that point could not ever again say these are enemy aliens. These were loyal Canadians. They'd proven it, some paying the ultimate sacrifice. UKSA existed until the end of the war. And then, of course, most of these young men and women did what most soldiers did. They came home and went on with their lives. But not all of them. Because during the war, a remarkable thing happened. Those Canadian, Ukrainian men and women in uniform, the sons and daughters of the internees and enemy aliens, and I keep emphasizing that because I want you to think about it, landed in Europe, fought on the beaches at Normandy. They were there on June the 6th, 1944. They fought inland. They liberated the concentration camps. They encountered everywhere they went Ukrainian displaced persons, DPs, victims of the war, survivors of the Holodomor, political refugees, your parents, some of you, your grandparents. And they said to themselves, we have proven who we are. Look at my uniform. No one's going to call me an enemy alien ever again. I've served my country. I've served the British Empire. And so now we have a right to say to the administration, to the powers that be, save the DPs, save the Divizia. These are the slave laborers of the Third Reich. These are men and women who suffered under Soviet and Nazi tyranny. These are our brothers and sisters. And we want them to come to Canada. We want them not to be repatriated to the Soviet Union. We want them to come to Canada, to Australia, to the United States. And the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, the Congress now, established the Ukrainian Canadian Relief Fund, and they raised money to help set up the Central Ukrainian Relief Bureau, KURB. And KURB continued under Bogdan Panchuk and Stanley Frolik and Tony Yadamovich and Hrapleva and others until 1952. So from 1945 to 1952, from the end of the war, for several more years, Ukrainian Canadians who had served in the ranks during the Second World War stayed in Europe and saved our parents or grandparents, my parents among them. And they were resettled then around the world, to the United States, to Australia, to Great Britain. The divizia essentially repatriated into Great Britain, and most of them stayed there. Some of you are the sons and daughters of veterans of the divizia. They were saved by the sons and daughters of the internees, allowed to resettle in Canada, where they gave us an opportunity for that better life that Yuri spoke about. Now think of the irony of this. I knew none of this story until the late 70s when I met the first internee, a man by the name of Mykola Sakalyuk. He was living in Toronto at the time. He told me how he had been interned at Fort Henry and then later at Kapuskasing. I met him because I bumped into a woman called Maria Khartanyuk, a strange little old lady living in Kingston, who told me that maybe I should someday talk to Nick Sakalyuk about being in Kingston in World War I. And I went to meet him. And I had no idea there had been internment operations because my parents had never told me about it because they didn't know. And Maria Khartanyuk said, you should also speak to this guy called Bogdan Panchuk because he saved people like your parents. And I'd never heard of Bogdan Panchuk or Stanley Frolick or any of them either. I was ignorant of our community's history in this country. Ignorance is not bliss. The truth will set you free. So, I interviewed these people, and I began hearing their stories. And ironically, not only did I find out about the internment operations, but I found out about what the internees' sons and daughters did to save my parents, the DPs. And in 1984, when I came back to Toronto for a postdoc at the University of Toronto, that was just when what happened? The Deschênes Commission was created, the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, headed by Mr. Justice Jules Deschênes, to look into the alleged presence of thousands, allegedly, of Nazi war criminals hiding in the Ukrainian and other East European communities. And heading up the defense team for the Ukrainian Canadian community was none other than the late John Gregorovich, the son of one of the founders of UNO, a pioneer settler's son, defending the DPs and the good name of the Ukrainian Canadian community. And people like John Sapinka, also the descendant of interwar immigrants. They not only rescued our parents and grandparents, they preserved and protected the good name of our community in the 1980s when the whole Deschênes Commission situation flared up, and it still has echoes to this day. There are those, both within Canada and outside Canada, who want to besmirch the reputation of the Ukrainian Canadian community, who under any circumstances attempt to undermine us for their own geopolitical interests, both the Soviets, now the Russians, and their fellow travelers here in Canada as well. It was the Civil Liberties Commission and John Gregorovich that spared us from those indignities in the 1980s. Now, that means, of course, at some point, we have to say thank you. And so I'm very pleased that in the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association over the years, we were established soon after the CLC ended its mandate, we have honored Philip Konoval, the Ukrainian Canadian who won the Victoria Cross. His plaque used to be just on the front of this building, but I see the bronze thieves have just stolen it, so it's gone. We'll have to replace it. We remember the internment operations. We told the story that the children and grandchildren of the internees could no longer tell because they had forgotten it or had never been taught it. So we recovered the history of Canada's first national internment operations, and we've told those. And the commemorative and educational work of the Internment Fund that was created in 2008 will continue that for several more years. It's important to remember that that story begins in Kingston, it continues into Toronto, where Mr. Sakalyuk was briefly held. It is a story that needs to be repeated and told many times over, and it was at Stanley Barracks, fittingly enough, that in 2008 we signed a settlement with Jason Kenney during the government of Mr. Harper that provided for the foundation of this endowment fund. Now, I am going to say just a very, very few words and then I'll conclude about what we asked for, because there's a great deal of confusion sometimes about this. We never asked for an apology. We said that we wanted the government of Canada to recognize what had happened. We did not think it was appropriate in 75 years later, 100 years later, to be telling the people of Canada, apologize for something that happened decades ago. We asked only for an acknowledgement, and we asked for symbolic redress. We never asked for compensation to survivors, and there still were a few around at the time. We never asked for compensation to any of their descendants. In fact, when we asked one of the survivors living in Hamilton at the time, Mary Manco Haskett, she was a young girl of 6.5 years old when she was interned at Spirit Lake in Quebec. I asked Mary, and I said, Mary, when we have this campaign, what should it be about? How much compensation should we be asking for? And Mary Manco, a little girl born in Montreal, who sat in the Spirit Lake internment camp and who watched her sister die there. We still don't know where she's buried. Mary said, Lubomir, your campaign should be about memory, not money. Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful. We thought, and I'll be true here, we thought it would be very simple to convince the government of Canada, the people of Canada, the public, that we deserved recognition and some kind of symbolic redress. It was anything but easy. Not only did we have some resistance from within our own community, but we were told by government officials that never happened. Ryan Boyko has done a great film using exactly that title. That never happened. And when they realized that that wasn't going to work as an answer, they said, well, why don't you Ukrainians just forget about it? And I said, well, when you tell the Japanese Canadian community that they should just forget about being rounded up in World War II under the War Measures Act, the way we were rounded up in World War I under the War Measures Act, when you tell them to just go away and forget about it, then I will accept the argument that we should all just go away and forget about it. I've never heard them say that to the Japanese Canadians. I've never heard them say that to the Italian Canadians. I've never heard them say that to Aboriginal Canadians. But to us, forget about it. Just go away. We didn't. And so for almost a quarter of a century, trust me, I never thought it was going to take that long, or I would have given up. But almost a quarter of a century before the government of Canada at Stanley Barracks provided symbolic redress and recognition. And it was only because of Bill C-331. You'll see a reference to it inside in the exhibit. It was Inky Mark, a Canadian of Chinese heritage whose own family paid the head tax, who was himself a victim of racism and xenophobia and prejudice. It was because of Inky Mark's Bill C-331 that we actually were able to have a foundation upon which we could negotiate the settlement. So always think about that. We live in a country where a Canadian of Chinese heritage was the best friend we had in Parliament when it came to this cause. Others were helpful in all the parties, so you can be a Liberal, Conservative, New Democrat. Many of you are Bloc Québécois, I know. The reality of it is, all of them have helped, but no one helped more than Inky Mark. It was Inky Mark's bill that got us the grounds on which we could negotiate. Well, all right, to conclude. When I was doing my graduate research and looking into the history of internment in Kingston, I was stunned when I discovered a quotation in the Daily British Whig, Canada's oldest daily newspaper. It's now the Whig Standard. Some of you have seen it. They were talking about the Wartime Elections Act of 1917, which disenfranchised, took away the right to vote from all East Europeans, mainly Ukrainians, who had arrived here after 1904. So in the first federal election, think about how important voting is. In the first federal election that Ukrainians could have voted and protested what was being done to them, they lost the right to vote. How convenient. How convenient. The Liberals, at the time, under Laurier, protested the Wartime Elections Act. And so liberal-minded newspapers across the country, the Whig newspapers as they were called, wrote about this and editorialized about it. And in the Whig Standard, my own hometown paper, I found this quotation. Now, the language is a little bit archaic, but you'll understand. Quote, "It is very probable that if the Wartime Elections Act becomes law, then the alleged foreigners and hitherto naturalized Canadians will bear their reproach meekly, but they will have sown in their hearts the seeds of a bitterness that can never be extinguished. The man whose honor has been mistrusted, who has been singled out for our national humiliation, will remember it And sooner or later, it will have to be atoned for. So the very first booklet we published on this was called A Time for Atonement. That was in 1988. It took us until 2008, but we got atonement. I think the time of truth is almost over. Commemorative projects, right? All sorts of educational efforts, art exhibits, films, all of this is wonderful stuff. It educates, it commemorates, it remembers. Is that enough? Are you happy with that? If you are, I'm happy to walk away. I'm an old guy now. Should we just stop and say, well, we got that done? We remembered what had happened to the pioneers, to the settlers, to the immigrants who came here before World War I. We've recognized and thanked their sons and daughters for their services and sacrifices and for helping save the DPs in World War II. We've honored Cunnaval. We've honored those Second World War veterans with the commemorative window, Heroes of Their Day project in England that we just unveiled. We've done it all. We've done it. We're finished. I think not. I started out telling you about the title of this exhibit, Pause in Plight. We are still afflicted. We are still suffering that intergenerational trauma of the internment operations. Not in our souls or in our genetic makeup, of course not, but organizationally in our structures. We have the resources. We have a $10 million fund that is coming back to the community in just a few years' time. What will we do with those resources? Panchuk and the veterans of the Second World War in 1946 tabled what they called the Renaissance Plan, a way in which they felt the new blood of the DPs and the old guard immigrants could be brought together to do greater things. I'm hopeful that with a new generation of artists like Ms. Parnell, of writers, scholars like our own daughter, Cassandra Lechuk, who's written Enemy Alien, with the new filmmakers who brought us a visual interpretation of what it must have been like to be in those internment camps. That we've done a lot of the commemorative work, we've done a lot of the educational work, although there's more still to be done. But where do we go next? How do we go forward? And I think that is really what we need to be as a community talking for. Where do we go forward? How do we go forward? How do we get past what happened to our forefathers? How do we overcome the tragedy that they so stoically endured? How do we organize the resources we now have, thanks to their suffering, to do something profound in the 21st century that will make sure that no Canadian of Ukrainian heritage ever suffers again the national humiliation that we endured during the Great War? To be continued. Thank you very much. Sorry, one last one. For those of you who are interested, a graphic history of the internment operations based on an original diary of an internee, a Ukrainian rounded up here in Toronto, and then taken to Capitol's case and called Enemy Alien, is available inside. And I have to brag, it's my daughter. Okay? And since COVID has changed everything, we don't know how we will be commemorating the Holodomor this year, whether it will be online, Zoom calls, webinars, I don't know. But one book I think I'd like to call to your attention, because it's virtually out of print already, was published just this year, just before COVID hit. It's called How People Live in Soviet Russia, and it's written by Mendel Osharovich. Mendel Osharovich was a Ukrainian Jew who moved to the United States, became a very important member of the Jewish socialist movement, and who in early 1932 returned to Trostianets in Ukraine, in central Ukraine, just as the famine was beginning. And in 1933, having seen what he saw, he broke with the left and wrote an expose. Wonderful, you say. 1933, New York, he publishes a book talking about millions of Ukrainians dying of famine. Except it was published in Yiddish only. And I don't think too many of us read Yiddish anymore. So the reality of it is, when we discovered this book, and thanks to the Holodomor Committee in Toronto, we were able to have it translated from the Yiddish to the English and published within just under a year. The book is now virtually out of print. I probably won't have time to come back or opportunity in November, particularly if the second wave hits us, to talk about this book. But if you want an eyewitness account of the early months of the Holodomor and a prognosis, and a very negative one, of what was likely to happen coming after him, this is a book you should take a look at, and it's available inside. Thank you very much.
Pane Doctor, thank you very much. We know you were visibly sort of disappointed with our setting, with the Sermon on the Mount, and we apologize for flattening the curve here before you showed up. In any case, we thank you very much for your well thought out comments on the internment and what it should mean to us. Most importantly, the memory part that everybody applauded you for, and I would ask another applause for Dr. Lutuk right now to help us with the memory aspect. I also have acknowledged people, and standing at the back I saw other people. I would like to acknowledge Pani Oksana and forum operator Forum TV. Tak samo бачу тут пан Микола Шварнек, наш добрий приятель, завжди цікаві фотографії з наших імпрез. Тепер попрошу ще раз пана Олега Лесюка, який має дальшу інформацію про сьогоднішню програму.
Знаю, що це вже трошки вам може задовго, але добре, що погода дозволяє. Я тільки пару слів вашої уваги хочу подякувати дуже багатьом людям, без яких сьогоднішня імпреза і відкриття нашої галереї було б неможливо. Отже, в першу чергу подякувати мисткині Керрі Парнell за чудову і дуже вражаючу виставку. Thank you, Kerri, for your very beautiful and very impressive art exhibition. The Endowment Council of the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund for financial support of this project. Shevchenko Foundation, Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, зокрема пані Світлана Медвідська за надання інформації для нашої першої такої інформаційної кімнати. Чулкан і Степчик, Chartered Professional Accountants. Lava Computers, Роман і Марія Винницькі. Доктор Любомир Луцюк, як вже було сказано, за сьогоднішній цікавий виступ і екскурс в історію, яка дійсно повинна бути, не забуватися, а навпаки ми повинні пам'ятати про це і так, щоб на майбутнє такого не повторювалося. Хочу подякувати голові дирекції КУМФу пану Юрію Клюфусу за підтримку і добрі поради. Виставковий комітету у складі Олега Лесюка, Роксоляни Мартин, Христини Кудрик за ідею цієї кімнати першої також, яку ви побачите, Марійки Винницької. Адміністратору КУМФ Діані Мельниченко за організацію виставки. За допомогу в експозиції виставки Іванові Лазірку і Тарасу Панькевичу. За інформаційну підтримку телепрограми «Контакт» і телепрограмі «Форум». Прес-реліз Марія Назар, Ліда Мороз і Уляна Гончак. Хочу подякувати Тарасу Прилинському і Уляні Гончак Тарасу Прилинському за музичне оформлення виставки і також разом з Уляною Гончак за сьогоднішню пряму трансляцію цієї події через нашу сторінку у Facebook. Також подякувати Print Plus Рустему Єрсаю за друк. Дуже вам дякуємо всім за вашу присутність і, звичайно, ми хочемо вас всіх бачити під час нашої виставки, але пам'ятайте про те, що ми тепер повинні дотримуватися порядку, не можете всі нараз зайти до галереї, трошки, кажуть, треба буде почекати на дворі, якщо хтось ще не бачив виставки, і зайти по колу, оглянути виставку і з задніми дверима можна вийти. Якщо буде зацікавлення в якійсь книжці чи каталозі, то прошу, чи в друку, то прошу зголошуватись чи до Діани Мельниченко, чи до мене, чи до когось з членів дирекції, ми вам в цьому поможемо. Так що дякуємо вам за присутність, сподіваємося, що ви сьогодні дістали задоволення від того, що прийшли. І прошу, Юрій.
Пане Олег, дякую, що ви всім подякували. І якось трохи дисонанс. Пан Олег попросив в нас, в української громади, порядок. То я надіюся, що ми так тут відповідно і правильно віднесемося до того. Справи ковіду і дирекції від різних державних установ вимагають певні обмеження. На дворі маємо обмеження 100 людей і маємо обмеження, що треба на 2 метри відстані триматися. Всередині маємо нагоду теж, щоб ви всі поодинчо на відстані 2 метрів оглядали виставку. І прошу цього притримуватися, бо там більше видно, якщо ми нечемні. Тепер пан Олег згадав всіх, яким ми вдячні. І так, щоб це гарно і образно, щоб створити таку річ, то не є праця 2, 3, 4 осіб, а праця цілої ширшої групи людей, яка над тим працює. І, зокрема, тою справою від самого початку займався, власне, Олег Лесюк, який зібрав навколо себе працьовитих людей в нашій групі чи комісії мистецькій, яка це все довела. То пану Олегу прошу знак признання. Далі, я не знаю, чи ви зауважили, але від часу початку ковіду до тепер ми в мистецькій фундації мусили закрити наше приміщення, але ми проводили так звані онлайн багато нових таких ініціатив, які нам поволі розвивалися і так і вдалися. Почали ми концерти музичні завдяки пану Тарасу Брилинському і пані Уляні Глинчак. Також почали серію розмов. І, як бачите, нічого не робиться за один раз, але цього тижня було інтерв'ю пана Лесюка, власне, на тему фундації сьогоднішньої виставки. І вже через розвиток всього, останнє моє повідомлення було, що вже 1000 людей оглядало це інтерв'ю по інтернету. То ми стараємося різними способами продовжувати нашу працю. Сьогодні, властиво, є традиційна наша виставка чи поняття виставки, але обставини тут трохи інакші. І ми тому вдячні всім вам, що ви так якби побили ту справу, що тримаємося нашого comfort zone і що ви прийшли тут підтримати нас в новій ініціативі. То тут, здається, вже почався процес підписів чи підписування до оглядини виставки. То прошу вас, не знаю, хто тут поліцай в цьому випадку. Пана Зірко, дуже приємно. То прошу зголошуватися і оглядати наші картини, а решта просимо тут. Я хотів подавати вино, але розумніші члени нашої дирекції переголосували, то ми нині, то так як перед Великоднем провадимо такий маленький піст. Але то поміняли з вина, то поміняли на горілку. Ні, на жаль. Окей, то просимо, дякуємо всім за вашу участь. Всього доброго.
Можна?